See what you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots.
Well, good morning. I'm John Fortier. I'm the director of the Democracy Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are here today with a great event with some great people. And it's a multi-purpose event, but I first want to note the prime purpose for having this event is that our fellow at BBC, Don Wolfensberger, has come out with a new book on Congress. I'm going to sell this to you, Changing Cultures in Congress, From Fair Play to Power Plays. I know we are getting into the holiday season here. It fits right into a stocking or under the tree or wherever, however you like to give presents. It would make a fine gift, not only to get the book, but also to improve the working of Congress, which is what Don aims to do. We also are here on the eve of some interesting congressional decisions. We have a new majority coming in. We have some you might have heard we have some potential leadership races. We also have some thoughts about reform, especially when a new majority comes in. That's been a tradition for the party coming from the minority to the majority to think about the way in which they're going to run the House of Representatives, and we'll talk certainly about that today. So let me introduce our panel. One third purpose. Third purpose today is, many of you know that each quarter, we put out something called the Healthy Congress Index. That comes out of a commission that we did here at BBC that Don and others were involved with. And it really looks at ways in which we might have this commission thought of a fair procedure that both sides could agree on. And what we do with the index is try to measure things like that are about the functioning of Congress, like how many days they're really working, how many open rules there are, or closed rules in the House of Representatives, how the amendment process goes in the Senate, how the budget process is going. So we have a new edition of that. In fact, Michael Thorning will introduce with the rest of the panel, who works with this with Don, will present some of the findings of this quarter. Again, we're not quite at the end of the Congress, but we're nearly at the end. So we'll have some really interesting findings about how this Congress has been doing compared to others. So Don Wolfensberger, I'm hinted at, but is the fellow here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, also a congressional fellow at the Wilson Center. Don is really a rare person in that he combines practical knowledge and experience in Congress with a scholarly view as well. He has sort of thrived in both of those worlds, again, which I think very few people have. He was the staff director of the House Rules Committee and minority staff director for a number of years, 28 years in the House all told. Is that
26 in the minority and 2 in the majority.
There we go, but at the very end.
It paid off.
Yeah. The long wait, yes. And of course, in that capacity, really thought a lot about the rules that govern the House, and especially how the minority is treated, but then also moving into the majority in an interesting time. Spent some time, and still spends some time at the Wilson Center directing the Congress Project, and now as a fellow. And then also is the author of a couple of books. One you have here today, and also an earlier book which I can recommend called Congress and the People, Deliberative Democracy on Trial. Many of you may also know him from his roll call column. Jennifer Victor, who's 2 seats down here, is Associate Professor, Professor of Political Science at George Mason University, scholar of Congress and a number of other things, has quite an interesting book about legislative member organizations, and also really does significant work on campaign finance and lobbying issues relating to the Congress. Molly Reynolds, a fellow at Brookings, author of another book. You could fill your tree or your stockings with lots of books here. This one, appropriately, maybe about the Senate, because Don is covering more of the House. Exceptions to the rule, dealing with the filibuster, but other ways in which there are mechanisms in the Senate to get around the 60-vote threshold for closing debate. Also is now the head and working for the series of Vital Statistics on Congress, which is a very valuable series that provides lots of statistics about congressional activity. And then we're also joined by Michael Thorning, who is a senior policy analyst here at BBC. And I mentioned Michael with Don really does the hard work of putting together our Healthy Congress Index. We're going to get to him, and he'll actually have a bit of a PowerPoint presentation on what we've been finding in the latest findings of the Healthy Congress Index. So we'll begin. What I'm going to do is turn to Don first to hear a little bit about some of the key points of the book. I do want to have a discussion about some of those issues, but also really about the leadership races, about reforms, about potential for reforms, and also to the Healthy Congress Index, so in that order. So, Don, I'm not going to ask you to recall the whole book, but the book is called Changing Cultures in Congress from Fair Play to Power Plays. And I guess the simple point is it's about a couple things. One, it really is about some case studies of how modern rules have been used in certain legislative case studies, but it's also about the culture of Congress and how you describe how it's changed from a place that did more legislating and maybe more governing, and has sort of fallen apart from that today as the institutions got more polarized. Do you want to say a little bit about just the broad place of rules and then the culture of Congress?
Yeah, not too many people are familiar with the esoterica of special rules, because you think on the one hand that each body has their own standing rules, and beyond that you sort of assume maybe that they're following those. Well, it's not the case. And what I started with here, and some of it's overlap with the background information that I had in my first book, but looking at the founders and what kind of rules they went by, what the purpose of the rules were. And I mentioned James Madison, Federalist 10, where he says it could happen that the Congress would end up being as unstable as some of the states, where members are pursuing their own self-interests and overlooking the public good. And therefore, it's really important to have rules of justice and the rights of the minor party. And what he found, and about a decade later, Jefferson found in writing his manual for the Senate of parliamentary procedure, was that if you do not have steady rules, strong rules that are well understood and enforced, you could end up splitting things so far apart that Congress would not be able to function. And so that was really the purpose of the rules, to protect the minority rights, but also to allow the majority to pursue its agenda. And we find that about a century later, you had a new guy on the scene named Thomas Brackett Reed, who was from Maine, and he was a little tired of all the obstructionism in the Senate, in the House, and so he started propounding his own rulings from the chair that overcame some of these obstructionist tactics that the Democrats were using. And he had a very low regard for the minority. He once said that the only right of the minority is to draw its pay, and its only duty is to make a quorum. And he said the rules are not designed to protect the minority, they are designed to allow the majority to function, to facilitate its own agenda. So we have this century-long change where things are evolving, and as things went on, and Reed really sort of engineered the whole idea of special rules through the Rules Committee, because in those days the chairman of the Rules Committee was the Speaker. 3 majority members, 2 minority members. But after he propounded these rulings from the chair, getting rid of dilatory tactics and disappearing quorums, he went to the Rules Committee and said, all right, here's what I've done. Let's put them in the standing rules now so that people will understand that the majority has a right to work its will. So it sort of took off from there. And I think that I don't want to go into great detail, but when things really picked up would be later in the 20th century, when parties began to sort. And so the majority was using its majority control to really sort of game things through these special rules. And so they would gradually were shutting out minority amendments that minority people wanted to offer. They were sort of tilting the whole thing towards the majority's wishes, its outcomes that it wanted. So that's the one thing that became very bothersome, and I think it has to do with the whole idea of party responsibility, something that scholars were talking about back in the 40s and 50s, but actually Wilson talked about it in his book back in 1885 on congressional government. But it was the idea that parties have a responsibility to pursue their agendas, and they can do what they want to really get things done.
So let me ask you, you brought up the party sorting, and I go back to your early time in Congress. When you began there, the parties were still by today's standards, certainly not sorted. There were plenty of there's plenty of division and diversity of political opinion within the Democratic Party, a strong right wing as well as a progressive majority or plurality in the caucus. But at the same time, 40 years of being in the minority, and you were really at the front of that, knowing that and seeing that in the Rules Committee. Republicans had a lot to complain about at the time and saying, well, that majority is being really heavy-handed and not giving our minority rights. It's really only after or later that we really see the sorting where votes are really down the line on both sides, party line votes. How do you see this move to just lots of votes being really strongly party votes in this majoritarian institution differing from what you would have seen as the kind of bad treatment by the longtime majority in the 40 years or so?
I guess in the first decade or so, I came in 1969 to work with John Anderson, my congressman from my home district, and he immediately put me as his staffer to help with his Rules Committee work. And back then, the only closed rules you really had were for tax bills out of the Ways and Means Committee. And so this was through the 60s. And then in 1979, there was a point at which a number of former Watergate babies were getting tired of all these Republican amendments on the floor. They wrote a letter to the Speaker and also to Dick Bowling, who was going to become chairman of the Rules Committee, and they said, we want fewer open rules, we want more structured rules, and so on. And so from 1980 on, you saw this ratcheting up on all committees. When bills were brought to the Rules Committee, we want a rule. How much debate time? Well, 1 hour, 2 hours. What amendment process? Well, we will abide by whatever the leadership thinks is appropriate. But that's when things really begin to change.
All right, and I definitely want to open this up, but I do want to get one last point that's key in the book, and especially your conclusion when you look at Congress as a legislating body and Congress as a governing body, and you go back to Woodrow Wilson about that. Tell us what that distinction is and why you think that Congress can play a role as a broader governing institution, or how it can.
Yeah, I think, Wilson in his book, Congressional Government, said that Congress is missing its biggest opportunity, which is to educate the public. A, through better oversight, B, through the informing function, and so on. So he said that this function is even more important than legislating because the people don't understand amendments and all the weeds of the legislative process. But Congress should be there to educate their constituents, as to what the big problem is. And so in my final chapter, I talk about moving from a culture of campaigning that we have now. Previously, we had a culture of legislating pretty much, but moving to, I call, big picture governing, a culture of governing where Congress would debate the big picture first and then go to the committees and have them sort things out as to how to follow through on those things. And so this is sort of following through on the whole Wilson idea, of basically a government by discussion, the informing function of Congress, how to shape public opinion, and so on. But then you'll notice that in 1907, when Wilson was giving a series of lectures updating his first book, he decided the president could do it all, that Congress really had missed its chance. The president could do the informing function. He could be the chief legislator. He could get his way because he could, educate and shape public opinion.
Okay. So let me turn to Jennifer. I think we're going to save for the discussion a little bit later, kind of current events and the leadership races and what might come up in reform. But your broad thoughts about the place of Congress and rules and sort of how the polarization over years has changed the way that the place works.
So it's interesting. As I was reflecting on the panel and thinking about what I might say this morning, I was reminded that a couple of years ago I was in this same room speaking on a panel on polarization, and one of the big points that I made at the end of that talk, and I actually don't remember what the themes were that we were discussing at the time, because I think this was, I don't know, 2014, 2015,
we
something like that.
We have the tape. We can probably go back to it.
Probably. But the point that I know that I came to at the end of that was one place that the country and the electorate could look towards reducing polarization is that there was a great sort of untapped body of political talent that hadn't been fully brought into political maturity in that sense. And I was talking about women and the dearth of women running for public office and so forth. And so it's, in some ways I was right and wrong. Like 2018, we're going to have 123 women in the House of Representatives, and it's a record-breaking number. We're going to have more female veterans than we've ever had. We're going to have Muslim women. We're going to have Native American women. And so the House is going to look a lot different. And in some ways, I think we will see that reflected in the basic operations and priorities and the way things go in the management. But on the other hand, so in that sense, maybe I was partly right. But the idea that electing a whole bunch of women can solve or cure polarization is clearly not accurate. The conditions for polarization are so structural and so really deeply embedded in our politics at this point that it's hard to look past. And to reflect a little bit on what Don was just speaking about, one of the ways that I think about it is, in the 20th century, what you had was this dominant Democratic Party in the House. And it was built on this odd coalition, kind of left over from the Civil War, where all of the Southern racial conservatives strongly identified with the Democratic Party because that was their party ID through the whole Civil War period and into the 20th century. And it was so strongly a part of Southern identity that they were unwilling to give it up. But as the Democratic Party coalition changed through FDR and the beginning of the 20th century, you wound up with this kind of odd Democratic Party coalition that worked for partisan dominance in that sense. Because that Southern coalition was really treated by the party as a faction. It wasn't the party's identity. It was treated as this offshoot of the party that often gained some power with leadership positions and committee chairs and so forth, often cut deals with the Republican Party. And so there were all of these, to today's eyes, unusual triangulated coalitions, bipartisan coalitions that were built through that period. And all of that changes as those Southern racial conservatives come into the Republican Party, which is where we are now. And it takes a generation, but by the time you get into the 1990s, it's full force. And what's interesting to me about the modern Republican Party is they don't treat that faction the same way the Democratic Party did. It's not treated, at the moment at least, in our current politics, as a faction of the party. It's the identity of the party, and that's largely because of the president. And the president always is, always will be the leader of the party. There's not much that's going to change under that. Trump is who he is. But some of what I think we're experiencing now in terms of that polarization is not just the reorganization of the parties, but the way that the party structures themselves treat their internal factions. And maybe we're going to come around to this later. It would be hard not to talk about it. But thinking about how the Democratic Party coming into the majority now differs so strongly from previous Democratic majorities that we've observed, particularly in the 20th century, not just in the way that I've just been speaking. But what you've got now in the Democratic Party is this, to my mind, one of the things I love about 2018 is I feel like it's this vindication of political science. Like it's been a vindication of polling, like all of this. 2016 was all kinds of weird and unsettling, and 2018 has just been, the fundamentals are working again. The institutions are doing exactly what we sort of predict them to do. And the Democratic Party is looking like that. They're doing classic retail politics. They've got their progressive faction, the leader that is not necessarily a part of that faction, but sometimes tries to be because her constituency is, but her leadership position isn't, is doing all of this sort of traditional political bargaining with that faction, and it's going kind of the way, like textbook style, that you would expect it to go. And so you're going to see regular tussling, and it's not going to be smooth, it's not going to be pretty, but I also think it's going to look very different from the Republican majority that we have just been in for the last number of years, where that faction of the party, the House Freedom Caucus to the Republican Party is a different animal than the progressive faction is to the Democratic Party, in that the House Freedom Caucus was not policy-oriented. They didn't so much have policy goals they were seeking, and they're strongly driven by negative partisanship, excuse me. And the Progressive Caucus is strongly policy-oriented. And so you can bargain with that. You can cut deals on policy deals, on issues, but it was harder for the Republican Party to do that with the Freedom Caucus. And so I think that's going to change fundamentally the nature of what we see happening in the House on a day-to-day basis.
Great. No, and we will go deeper into some of those things in the next round. So let me turn to Molly. I don't want to limit you to the Senate. I'm going to pigeonhole you here. But you know, Don obviously has sketched a way in which, through history, the House, especially a very majoritarian body, and the polarization causing the parties to be more unified, and therefore, real clash with how much you use the rules in a majoritarian way. I would say the Senate, probably the same tendencies are there, but you're bumping up against a set of practices and rules that make it not majoritarian, and maybe those pressures go against that. And in fact, that's really the theme of your book. So would you reflect on sort of the history of that and the pressures on rules in the Senate coming out of the polarization?
Sure. Thanks, John. So one thing that I really liked about Don's book, and that I think speaks both to the House and to the Senate, and it works a little bit differently in the two chambers for some of the reasons that you outlined, is that Don makes this argument that in many cases, both throughout history and certainly in the current period, that the rules choices we observe are really driven by partisan concerns, that they're not necessarily made out of a kind of principled view of how the chamber should work. That's not to say that's never a part of the story, but a lot of the times the way that we see the rules both evolve over time and change, and then how exactly they're deployed in different circumstances. He walks through in the book a very nice case study of the original passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, and how all kinds of rules maneuvering was part of that story. So this idea that procedural choice is really about kind of partisan goals and the what you can do with the rules that you use and what outcomes that facilitates, I think is a really major theme that I took away from Don's book that I do think applies to both the House and the Senate. Obviously, the Senate has the filibuster that creates a particular institutional environment, but I think that kind of major strain runs through both chambers. Another thing that I took away from Don's book that I think is relevant to both the House and the contemporary Senate is the degree to which now rules are used and changed not just in a way that's meant to engineer policy victories for the majority party, but also in ways that are meant to protect members of the majority party from having to take difficult votes on the floor of the chamber. I would add to that that they are used and changed in ways that are meant to make members of the minority party also take difficult votes. So it's not just that the majority party is looking to protect its own members from having to take unpopular stands. It's also that they can be used to try and embarrass members of the minority party. The minority party is not immune from this same impulse. So Don talked about the decline of open rules in the House over time. I've argued that one consequence of that is that on the few things that still get open rules, which tend to be appropriations bills, we actually see a lot more kind of partisan mischief than we used to, because when you take away all of the other opportunities to do so, the impulses of members will flow to whatever chances they still have. And I think we tend to see a kind of similar dynamic in the Senate. And again, it plays out a little bit differently because the existence of the filibuster and the tradition of unanimous consent and negotiating unanimous consent agreements about which amendments will get offered, I think is it's a somewhat different institutional context, but I think a lot of the same kind of partisan and political dynamics that Don talks about in the House really do apply, especially in the contemporary Senate. And in a Senate like the one that we've seen for the past 2 years, where there's a very narrow margin of control for the majority party. So the majority party doesn't necessarily have a lot of room to maneuver to lose votes. It needs to keep all of its members on board if it wants to try and get anything done.
All right, so I'm going to turn to Michael. I made laid out the case of what we had done coming out of the Commission on Political Reform. There are a number of measures that we measure each quarter compared to historically other Congresses. I'll let you characterize some of them, but I think broadly, this was a group of people who were, many of them former members of Congress, some of them leaders, a couple of majority leaders of the Senate, as well as leaders in the House, but also members who were not in leadership. And I think it's an interesting exercise in coming to agree what a decent process would be for Congress to work. It's a little different in the House and the Senate, so we measure different things. I would say it's all about minority rights. I think those people were balancing what the majority needs and what leadership needs to make the institution function well, more time in Washington, things like this, as well as certainly some place for open debate in minority rights. So it's we think it has the potential for sort of looking at Congress and being able to judge them as to how well they're following up on these rules. So why don't I turn to you, Michael, and make the presentation.
Thank you, John. And one thing I'll say is we're going through some of this data. This is all compared to previous Congresses, but we try to keep it in all the same time period. So for all the Congresses we'll be looking at comparatively, it'll be through the first 21 months. So we'll just dive right in.
And eventually you'll get the next one. You'll get the whole Congress for all the comparisons.
That's right. And we expect that'll be out sometime in January, and that'll look at full 115th Congress and then all of our previous ones. So our first metric here is on working days. The Commission on Political Reform recommended a 5-day work week where Congress would be in session for 5 days, 3 weeks at a time, and then have a week off for members to go back to their districts, their states, and do the work that they do there. And so you'll see here there's two kind of dotted horizontal lines. Those represent where we would expect Congress to be in terms of working days at this point if they were adhering to something close to a 5-day work week. As you can see, that the House historically has not really been too close to that, and they still remain below it. The Senate, sometimes in its history, has had years where they worked about a 5-day work week, or sometimes a little bit more, and this one's pretty close, and some of that was sort of powered by the fact that the Senate remained in session for much of the normal August recess, which kind of gave them a little boost, and probably without that they'd be lagging about where they were in previous years. This one is on committees and bills being reported by committees. The Commission, basically had a major recommendation that the committees take on a much more active role than they have in recent years in terms of actually writing and marking up bills instead of bills coming from leadership. As you can see here, there was kind of a lull in the 111th, 12th, and 13th Congresses, and then the 114th Congress, which is about the time that both the Senate, the House had already flipped, but the Senate had flipped at that point to Republicans, and you kind of see this I don't know, the gates sort of opening up, of the possibility that Congress could actually enact some of these bills, and so we've seen a lot of activity from the committees in the last couple Congresses. And this next one is on the filibuster, just on legislation in the Senate. We're not looking at nominations here. And I think the most striking thing is that in this Congress you can see a huge drop-off. And part of what explains that, the Senate has not spent a lot of time, the current Senate, on measures that you really could filibuster. So they've spent a lot of time at the beginning of the Congress on Congressional Review Act related legislation, and then they spent a good amount of time on reconciliation related legislation and related to the budget, trying to pass a health care bill through that. And then the other major thing that they've spent time on is nominations, which both is not really reflected here, but also the threshold to be able to filibuster a nomination now is down at 50, and so it's pretty unusual even then that you could successfully filibuster a nominee. Although I'll say their attempts on that are up in terms of nominations, but Just looking at legislation here, you can also see that most of the time, filibusters are not successful even when they're attempted this Congress. Mostly the Senate's been able to get through the legislation that they have had on the floor, which is sort of, you compare that to last Congress, the 114th, and there's a major difference there. And what that really comes down to probably is the change in administration. Previously you had in the 114th a Republican Senate, Democratic president, and Democrats in the Senate really looking for ways either to keep the president from having to veto things, or Republicans sending bills, or Republicans putting bills on the floor that Democrats weren't going to agree with anyway, and so really trying to block that. And now we're looking at amendments in the Senate. The current Senate is the second lowest right now in recent history, and almost half of these, it's not reflected here, but we're on appropriations bills, and really outside of that, there has not been a whole lot of activity on amendments in the Senate. And a trend here, you can sort of see historically, amendments have been divided up about 50-50 between the majority and the minority, or maybe a little bit more favoring the majority. And we've seen that trend shift where the majority, since Republicans have taken over the Senate, the majority has actually tended to get more and more of the amendments, which really doesn't leave a lot of room for Democrats to contribute to legislation, try to improve it, get some of their priorities in it, and maybe things that might get them to actually vote for what might be considered Republican bills. Here, this is really, Don's work really powers all of this slide here. Don has been collecting data on, as he said, special rules in the House that control whether or not members are allowed to offer amendments on the floor. And I think the best way to describe this slide is a demonstration of the fact that new leadership will always promise to do better, and they almost never do.
Or they do for a little while sometimes.
Yes, yes. So after Speaker Boehner, who was himself presiding over a very closed floor process for offering amendments, Speaker Ryan came in and said that he was going to change that, and really hasn't been able to. And those decisions, the leadership has a lot of influence over that, but sometimes just the dynamics going on in the caucus or the conference really have a lot to do with what type of rule a bill comes to the floor under. So we've seen, closed rules are accounting for more than half of the bills. That means no amendments for any members on the floor. And there are no open rules. And as Molly described, we've kind of seen that trend, and there are different reasons for why that's happening. And the only other time we've had no open rules, if you look at the 111th Congress, so that was the time when you had a new Democratic majority, or a Democratic majority, a Republican majority in the House, and actually, no, I'm actually just getting that wrong. Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate and the White House, so it does not look all that different from the 115th, where you have a similar situation with Republicans controlling both chambers and the White House. Some of the incentives there really are for just the majority to control the process, get the bills out that they want, hope that they pass the Senate and are sent to the president. And so, we'll see if that changes here in the next Congress. And our last one here, we're looking at conference committees. This is a trend that's been going on for a long time. Walter Oleszek at CRS, there's a great report that he wrote years ago about whether the role of conference committees. The chambers just are not choosing to use conferences to resolve differences between bills, and that really has not changed much in the 115th Congress or in the last few. Although I'd note that, again, we have a situation here where the appropriations process really kind of finally powered the current Congress into using some conference committees. I think they account for half of the four were on appropriations bills. And so, that's one point I'll make, is that Congress was much more successful this year in the appropriations process. They passed 5 of the 12 appropriations bills that they were supposed to. 7 others are under a continuing resolution. But in that process, it boosted the Senate in terms of amendments, and it boosted conference committees, and so some conclusion there. When Congress is really doing its work, it kind of forces them, in some ways, to do the things we'd expect them to in a kind of more fair and more fair process and under regular order.
Great, thank you, Michael. I want to talk a little bit about leadership races, about reforms, possible reforms. So let's start with the fact that we are on the eve of determining who our next Speaker of the House will be in the next Congress. A simple question would be, who's going to be the next Speaker of the House and why? But I think I'd also like to get into some of what Jennifer was bringing up, the nature of the caucuses, the nature of people coming in, and the nature of leadership that comes to them. So, Don, your reflections on the process so far the Democrats have been going through to select new leadership. If you want to do predictions, you can, or you can just analyze.
Yeah, my book goes up through the 114th Congress, but what I also look at, basically, my case studies began when Democrats took over the House in 2007 and so on, so I have the whole opening day thing when Nancy Pelosi was first sworn in as Speaker. What has changed since then, other than the fact that they only lasted for 2 terms in the majority and the Republicans retook control? But I think it's obviously more difficult for Pelosi and her 2 other leaders, all septuagenarians, and hey, I don't knock it, I'm one, but to really grab hold of the imaginations of the newer members who have been elected, and they want new leadership. I don't think that they disagree with things that Pelosi has done previously as Speaker and as Minority Leader. She is very adroit, as a politician, having grown up as the daughter of the mayor of Baltimore, and she knows how to count votes, and she just will tell her other colleagues, just give me the names of who we still need to get to, and I will talk with them. And so she is working at this, and obviously I think today she's going to have an easy time of it getting the nomination for Speaker by her caucus. But then on January 3rd, the question is, how many members are still out there that have vowed to their electorate that they will not vote for Pelosi as Speaker? Will they say, well, I voted against her in the caucus, so that's enough? Or will they vote present on opening day, January 3rd, so that she has a less high threshold to meet a majority of those present and voting, either for Pelosi or McCarthy? So I think that's going to be a very interesting dynamic, and obviously some of her cachet that was there in 2007 is no longer there, as you've got some very new, impatient members that obviously want to do a lot more than maybe she has in mind. I mean, she has been advising her colleagues in the leadership and so on. Let's not have overreach, whether it's in investigations or we're trying too much legislatively, that it's going to look foolish. But I think they will still put some things over in the Senate's doorstep that the Senate will not go along with. So they have to make a record. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how the leadership balances out the oversight investigations along with their policy goals. I saw Elijah Cummings, who's going to be the chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, on one of the talk shows last week, and he was being asked over and over, well, which investigations are you going to conduct, because you are the key oversight committee of the House? And he said, well, let's keep in mind that there are other things and investigations that my committee has to oversee, including, the census, and he mentioned some other important things. But he said, keep in mind that we only have 2 years. And that is a thing that in my book I find is usually the explanation by why these leaders always go back on their promises for regular order and more open process and so on, and then they realize, hey, we've only got 2 years and we could lose power at the next election. So they sort of set aside these nice open process reforms so that they can get their agenda through. And so I think we're going to see more of that. Do I predict that Pelosi will prevail on January 3rd? Probably, although I tell people I'm not a political prognosticator. I'm more of a procrastinator. I wait till after the election to tell you what the votes mean, and what might happen from that point on.
Predictions are always hard, especially when they're about the future.
Exactly.
Exactly. I learned Yogi Berra and Kierkegaard said. I think that's one follow-up. You talk in the book. You cover the Cannon speakership and the revolt against Cannon. The reason I bring that up is, one, it'd be interesting if you see any parallels, and two, we'll get to some of the rules and reform changes, but some of that revolt had to do with changes in the way the House would run, and some of the opposition to Nancy Pelosi is new members who signed pledges or promised not to vote for her, maybe for political reasons, but some of this comes from a group of members who are looking for rules changes as well. So do you see parallels between some of the Cannon revolt and what were the atmosphere we have today?
Yeah, keep in mind that Cannon was not removed as Speaker, although he did give them a chance to do that after he was removed as Chairman of the Rules Committee, and they went to an elected Rules Committee after that. But he was tightening up on what bills could go to the floor for one thing and what amendments could be offered for another. His famous saying was, "We don't need no new legislation, everything's fine back in Danville, Illinois." But are there parallels? Of course, because, and we see these throughout history, where you have a progressive, in the case of the Cannon revolt, you had a progressive wing of the Republican Party that joined with the Democrats to provide the sufficient votes to really remove Cannon from the Rules Committee. It is, interestingly enough, it's still considered the Speaker's Committee, although speakers have not tried to go back on it, but they don't have to. They can issue their orders from the Speaker's office, and the Rules Committee chairman usually snap to. I think the interesting thing about Jim McGovern, who's going to take over as the Rules Committee chairman, Democrat from Massachusetts, is that he has, one, been put in charge by Pelosi of bringing together all the rules reform proposals from various members, and they put out a list of those proposals, and that's not to say some other ones that didn't make the cut won't be voted on. I'm not sure how their process works within the caucus, but I suspect that some of the other ones will be voted on. But he has also indicated that he wants to be more open than the Republicans on allowing amendments from both parties to be offered on the floor. And one of the things that's in the package that he endorsed was that no bills can go to the floor under a rule if there had not been a hearing and markup of that bill that's involved in committee. I'm just wondering how long that will last, because in this last
H.R. 1 will it last past that?
Yeah, until H.R. 1, which will be their good government bill on opening day that they will slam through under a closed rule. But in any event, this is what tends to happen. The Republicans did the same thing when they took over in '95. But I think at least McGovern wants to change the tone and the scope of what the Rules Committee can do to help other members with their own districts and their own priorities.
So, Jennifer, if you want to take the bait about predicting whether Pelosi will be and how the process that she's been trying to keep her or become Speaker, but also I know you started on a pretty interesting reflection on the nature of the caucuses and maybe something say about that related to this decision.
So I don't feel like I'm going out on too much of a limb predicting that she'll probably be the Speaker. And mostly that's because she doesn't appear to have an opponent. And a number of the newly elected members who at first either made some, to me, seemed like apparently kind of light campaign promises not to support her, or recently after the election initially made some public statements that suggested they maybe had some misgivings about supporting her. Most of those that I've seen seem to have come around, which means she's gotten to them, right? So she knows what she's doing. But I also interpret Pelosi's behavior as being relatively receptive. So she's got this progressive wing. She's got this, a bunch of new members of her caucus that are asking for different leadership, asking for newer blood. So I suspect that we will see some of that. That she's, who knows what it is exactly, but I suspect she's made some agreements as to how to respond to some of those concerns. What I think is important to remember here is that at the end of the day, the Speaker of the House has one job. The only job of the Speaker of the House is to keep the majority. And keeping that majority is a delicate balance between roiling the caucus and getting everybody to toe the party line when you need them to, and letting them not toe the party line when they need to appease their constituencies and whatnot. It's also worth reflecting that she's got a number of districts that she'll probably be kind of worried about. I'm thinking of the district in Virginia that Spanberger just picked up. That was Eric Cantor's seat and then David Bratt's seat. So that's relatively reddish district that has now gone to the Democrats, and I suspect it'll be a vulnerable district. And there's a number of others like that around the country that I think Pelosi will probably want to be keeping her eye on and thinking, what can we do policy-wise or for these members or financially in terms of campaign finance or leadership PACs or whatnot that can help these members out? What do we need to do to keep them in this caucus and to keep those seats from flipping? And that'll involve some relatively tricky trade-offs for the Democratic caucus, I think.
Right, and just you hinted at it before, but Pelosi dealing with her progressive wing, that's policy in many ways and sort of finding some accommodation, but some of the rules changes that are being proposed by some of the people opposing her are not all coming from the progressive wing. Some of them I might say that progressives would support as good government. Some a leader might view as limiting ability to really run the House. So how do you take that negotiation? I
think of the strength of leadership in and actually Molly and Don might have more specific thoughts on this than I do, but in my simplistic way of thinking about the trend of House leadership over the years has been that going back to Reed's time. And then Uncle Joe Cannon's time, you have this trend of power getting concentrated in the House and the speakership, and members eventually getting tired of that and doing some revolts. And so throughout the 20th century, first you disempower the speaker by empowering the committee chairs in the 1970s. Then we had the subcommittee empowerment that went on until you basically come around to Gingrich's time when, again, leadership and power gets kind of concentrated again in the speakership. So there's this natural pendulum, I think, that goes in the House of Representatives that to some extent I think has been strongly concentrated at the top. I think the pendulum is back to a very strong speakership over the last number of speakers that we've seen, and the rules reflect that. And so some of what we're seeing is now some discomfort with that. But to my mind, it's the way the Democrats handle that may in some ways be reflective or indicative of the Democratic Party writ large. Because what the Democratic leaders and members of the caucus are going to be struggling with in Congress is in some ways exactly what the Democratic Party and the electorate is struggling with, which is how small d Democratic do we want the party to be versus how much control do we want the elites and the leaders to have to help solve those collective action problems and give the party the guidance that it needs. And there's clearly a strong trend in American politics over the last couple of decades to go more small d Democratic, and I'm making this gesture because it's happening in both parties, right? So you've got the sort of populist wing in the Republican Party, that's sort of this anti-elitism, anti-establishment trend, and then in the Democratic Party you've got that same, sort of started with the Occupy movements and the themes that the progressives are picking up now on in the Democratic caucus. And all of those are trends that take the party leadership power away. And some of the reforms that they're now talking about, the Democrats are talking about in Congress, are in that same vein. So in some ways, I think this is good for politics and good for policy because I think it's natural for us to have this tension and struggle between concentrated power and more populist democratic kind of functions. And so for that, to see that pendulum swing and to have those debates and those tensions, I think is in some way healthy. The part that concerns me a little bit is that the way I think a lot of Americans tend to think about it is that partisanship is our problem, and so therefore that means parties are the problem. We conflate partisanship and parties a lot, I think, particularly in the electorate. And I think that's a huge problem because I think disempowering the parties and the parties to do their job in terms of weeding out incompetent candidates or whatever else, and solving all those important coordinating functions, disempowering parties from doing those, I think ultimately will not serve us well.
So Molly, Speaker Pelosi, you're going to surprise us.
No, I'm not a surprising person, John. No, I mean, I'm with both Don and Jennifer in thinking that Pelosi will probably be elected Speaker. To me, sort of two important dynamics that this fight over whether she will be Speaker, have illustrated for me is one, excuse me, the tension in contemporary American politics between seeing the Speaker of the House as a really important party leader, particularly as a national figure, particularly when, as is the case for Democrats right now, they only control the House. It's their only level of power on the national stage. So in one sense, we see the Speaker of the House as a really important party leader, as a national figure. You only need to look at the number of ads that were run about Pelosi in electoral campaigns, largely by Republicans, to see this. But at the same time, the actual vote to pick that person requires a support of a supermajority of the party's House caucus. So that's a tension. We see this person as a party leader, but for that person to ascend to that position, they actually need the support of a supermajority. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, which picks up on something that both Don and Jennifer mentioned, is the level of frustration among some members of the House Democratic Caucus with the centralized nature of power in the House. And Jennifer's right that there's been somewhat of a pendulum on that over time. Generally, that's corresponded to the presence or absence of divisions within the majority caucus. And so often we see that when the majority caucus is more divided, the Speaker needs to devolve a little bit more power outside of his or her hands in order to please all of the factions. And then in times of greater party unity, we see stronger speakers. One thing that's, I think, been really tricky for Pelosi and will continue to be difficult for her going forward is the degree to which meeting the demands of some of the kind of mid-career members who have been frustrated with their inability to ascend through the ranks of the party is in direct tension with meeting demands of other key blocs within her caucus. And so here I think particularly about something like term limits for committee chairs. So Republicans adopted term limits for committee chairs back in the mid-90s. That has certainly had the effect of more turnover among people who have leadership positions in the Republican conference. You see some Democrats saying, oh, why don't we do this? This has given more Republican junior members the ability to ascend through the ranks. And so, sure, maybe that would be a solution to one of the problems that Pelosi faces. But at the same time, one of the biggest proponents of maintaining a strict adherence to a seniority norm and no term limits on committee chairs are groups in her caucus, like the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, that see these rules and norms as one of their primary sources of influence within the party, and they represent very important segments of the Democratic base. And so there's a lot of, she's managing a lot of different tensions here. Like these guys, I expect that she'll figure out a way to do it to get to that 218 or whatever a numerical majority of those voting for a member by name is on the floor in January. But it's, like it illustrates what she's going through and what she'll have to go through in the future illustrates some broader dynamics that we're seeing in politics.
Yeah, let me follow up. She put her finger on a very important point, and that is the idea of three-term limits on not only committee chairmen, but subcommittee chairmen in the House. When the Democrats retook control in 2007, Pelosi allowed that rule to stay in the rules on the opening day package. Why? Well, she wanted the chairman to know that they were still going to have to be subordinate to her. And so on the second Congress that they were reelected in the majority, they removed that rule. But it'll be interesting to see how they deal with it this time, because, as you point out, a lot of these newcomers don't want to hang around for 10 or 20 years before they can move up to take over a committee or subcommittee chairmanship. So, and on the other hand, as you point out, groups like the Black Caucus, who have had a great deal of seniority and don't want to give up the chairmanships that they are just now beginning to move into. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic, I think, playing out in the Democratic caucus.
So, Michael, Speaker Pelosi, you got a chance to differentiate yourself. All the money is on one side of the table here.
No differentiation here on that. But I do think there's something interesting as we're talking about reforms and rules. One reform that was kicked around for a while that's kind of disappeared, or at least hasn't been talked about as much, and that was proposed rules around basically the ability of House members to oust the Speaker. We saw the last two Republican speakers. Certainly, Speaker Boehner was under a lot of pressure from groups like the Freedom Caucus, and then I think Speaker Ryan always sort of had this looming threat over him, of a motion to vacate, which any individual member can bring in the House. And as we were getting closer to the change in this Congress, people were starting to talk about, well, should we make it more difficult for individual members to bring this to the floor and try to oust a speaker, and that would sort of solve this problem of whether the speaker was sort of constantly vulnerable, and that discussion has sort of gone away, and I don't know if that's probably a reflection of the fact that that was maybe more of a Republican problem at the time, and so now that Democrats are taking over, people aren't really so interested in that reform. But one has to wonder if that is going to come back up if Speaker Pelosi finds herself in similar positions of difficulty negotiating with different factions within the Democratic caucus, and if she, if there should be a revolt, will people start again talking about the fact that it's fairly easy, in the House to bring forward, at least to start the process of trying to remove the speaker. It's not as easy to actually accomplish that, but there was a question for some time. We were talking about reforming the House, of whether we should think about bolstering the speaker from this threat rather than leaving them open to it, and that discussion has sort of gone by the wayside. So,
well, at least Republicans removed the term limits on speakers too. They changed the rules so that no longer applies, and that was during Hastert's reign.
So it's a good segue, because I do want to turn to rules and reform possibilities. And I will note, partly because my chair is angled this way, I have a bit of a blind spot in talking about rules. We have Senator Snowe is in the audience, who I didn't see before, who was, we mentioned our Commission on Political Reform, who was a co-chair of that. And also, of course, their time in the Senate and the House had time to think about both bodies. So maybe we can hear from you and the questions on that. But so I do want to get the panel's thoughts about the possibilities for reform. There's a lot on the table, right? There's been some talk about two-year budget reform and a committee that's been looking at that. That was a recommendation of our commission. The Democrats have at least the outlines of a package that will be part of H.R. 1, some of which is about Congress, but some of which is about other forces like voting rights and lobbying and campaign finance. And there have been proposals on both sides to either have a joint committee to study, or perhaps in the Democratic side now a study group of the House. So what are your thoughts about what's possible, and what do we know from history about the way some of these things go?
Could I start with a historic analogy? In 1923, the progressives in the Republican Party were again flexing their muscles, very narrow gap between Republicans and Democrats, and so a lot of these progressives voted for other people for Speaker other than Frederick Gillette, who was the nominee of his caucus. So who stepped in but Underwood, Longworth, Majority Leader for the Republicans, says, let's strike a deal here. The deal is this: we adopt the rules from the previous Congress temporarily. We elect Gillette temporarily, but in the meantime, the Rules Committee will have 32 days to have hearings and find out what reforms members are really interested in. And so they went through that whole process. They adopted some of those reforms, and things were just fine. The only thing that changed in the next Congress, when Republicans had a bigger majority, was they took the progressive that had gotten a seat on the Rules Committee off the Rules Committee. But I'm just thinking about the thing that you mentioned, that the Democrats have already endorsed the idea of a select committee on improving the operations of Congress. And I think that is something that Pelosi is using very craftily to say, look, you don't have to have everything done on opening day. Here's a select committee. I think they'd be wise to put a time limit on it for reporting so that they could then move forward, but so these other members would have a chance to appear before the select committee, give their ideas for reforms, and come back. But that would be especially helpful if Pelosi doesn't get the majority and they have to select a temporary speaker. I mean, think about it. There's something in history where, who was it? It was John Quincy Adams was elected chairman of the House of Representatives while he's still trying to sort out the speakership. But I was talking with my wife about this today, and we both had the same idea before we started talking about today, and that is, what if the Democrats, if Pelosi didn't get a majority of the House votes, what if the Democrats decided to appoint a temporary speaker named Joe Crowley? You don't have to be a member of the House to be speaker. He was chairman of the caucus. Now, that would be a stick in the eye of the woman who beat him in the primary. But, you know, there are other things that could happen that could help resolve that while the Select Committee is going through the motions.
I thought you were going to go the full John Quincy Adams analogy and go for Jimmy Carter as a speaker, or maybe Barack Obama. Or,
they've gotten votes, but, you know.
Jennifer.
So I sort of expect that what we're going to see happen, that the Democrats are going to try to find a balance between reform-oriented and process-oriented, including investigations kind of stuff, and policy. And I think that in order to keep the electorate engaged with them and motivated, which of course is what they need to do for 2020, if they're to keep the majority, they're going to have to make moves on both sides. I do think we're seeing signs from the leadership, from Pelosi particularly, that she wants to be a bit more cautious on the policy or the process and investigation stuff, so whether or not that means we actually see movements towards impeachment, I don't know. It's not clear exactly at this point how that would help the Democrats. But that may also depend on what else happens between now and the next 2 years. Yeah, Mueller and everything else, exactly. So that could change. But if I was going to pick 3 things that I think the Democrats either should work on or are likely to work on, I don't know if those are the same thing, I would say they are reforms along the line of election integrity, particularly bolstering the Voting Rights Act. You know, I think Shelby versus Holder in 2013 undercut the Voting Rights Act in ways that were so profound that we are just now seeing the ramifications of those. And some of what we saw go on in this last cycle in Georgia and Florida, in some ways, I think are reflective of that. And I think a lot of people understand that and see the need for some renewed commitment to Voting Rights Act principles that were set in 1965. So whether that looks like stuff about election integrity or voter registration or voter roll maintenance, or maybe you know, a clever thing would be to get the federal government to create some incentives for states to do their reapportionment commissions and district line drawing commissions as independent. I've never, you know, I don't see any movement towards that, but I think those would all be good things to hear Democrats be talking about in terms of good government reform. So in addition to election integrity, the other 2 things that I would put on the list are on the policy side, I expect them to make moves on immigration. It's obviously an issue that's resonating with the Republican electorate. It clearly has constituencies in the Democratic electorate. It's a huge need. And so in terms of policy resonance, I think it's there. The Democrats, I think, have been all over the place policy-wise. I have no idea what the Democrats want to do on immigration. So they'd have to get that coordinated if that's where they want to put it. I might turn my list of 3 into 4. Third, I think campaign finance reform is an unlikely place, but a productive place for the House to go. And I don't know exactly what campaign finance reforms might look like. If I was writing them, it would be something that would strengthen the party organizations, like the DNC and the RNC and the various sub-organizations there. But I don't think that's politically palatable or popular for the reasons I talked about earlier. But I do think, you know, Don earlier was talking about, and some of the stuff in the book, talking about sort of the commitment to the permanent campaign that goes on and how productive it would be to get beyond that or to change that narrative. And in my mind, the whole reason that happens is because it costs so much to run and there's so much pressure on raising funds all the time. And so doing something along those lines, I think, would be productive. And then the last thing that I think maybe has real possibility, bipartisan possibility, is infrastructure. There's obviously a huge need for infrastructure investment. Trump talks about it. Republicans, it used to be the one thing that we could always count on Republicans and Democrats to be able to come together on. So maybe we could see a return to that particular policy issue.
Great. I'm going to turn to Molly, but I'm also going to give a little heads up. We're going to turn to your questions soon. I know that we have some microphones in the audience, so I'm going to get them ready and turn to Molly.
Yeah, so on this question of reforms that the Democrats might take up in the House, I'll say two things. One, I'll be really interested to see to what degree there are any actual moves to try and empower committees in the House. So Don mentioned before this proposal to require anything that comes to the floor to have had a hearing and a markup. I agree that that's a real, sounds nice at the beginning. How long is this going to last? There's a big commitment to follow through question here with a lot of things. But the advantage to Democrats of trying to take some steps to empower their committees are several. So first of all, it does help address some of these concerns among rank and file members that power is too centralized in the hands of the leadership. If you could make people feel like committees and subcommittees are places where real policy work is done and give them a reason to invest in spending time on that work, I think that would be good from a kind of caucus maintenance perspective. The other thing that I will say is that Democrats, as a party that control just the House and not the Senate or the White House, one thing that's valuable to them over the long term is to spend some time thinking about, what would an agenda look like the next time we do have unified party control. And one thing that can be valuable, and we actually saw in 2017 what happens when Republicans didn't do this, when they had a congressional majority but not someone in the White House, is spending some time working out differences within the party about how you want to approach a particular policy agenda item. So Republicans did not spend a lot of time figuring this out on the Affordable Care Act, and so then when push came to shove and they actually had the opportunity to do something on it in early 2017, they were kind of all over the place. They didn't quite know where they wanted to go. And so I think that empowering committees and making them a place where real policy work can be done in the House is good both for managing the caucus and also politically for the party as it looks forward to a time when maybe it has more levers of control in Washington. And the last thing I'll say on reforms, I'll be watching what happens with earmarks. So there's been a lot of talk about whether earmarks will come back. I'm not a person who thinks earmarks are some magic bullet, but I think they can have value in a separation of powers perspective. If you think about the money is going to get spent and Congress should have more of a say in how it gets spent, there can be value to having a responsible earmark system. So that's another thing that I'll be paying attention to over the next couple of weeks to see what Democrats decide to do about that.
Yeah, and keep in mind the earmark rule is still in the standing rules of the House. The only thing that's prevented them from going forward and doing them was the House Republican Conference rule that says chairman cannot report these things, but that is still right there. They don't have to create a new rule with accountability and everything else.
Can do it without taking affirmative action.
Great. All right, well, I'm going to use this transition again to mention changing cultures in Congress from fair play to power plays. There are books being sold out in the front. We have microphones, and we're going to turn to you. So please identify yourself. As always, ask a question, not make a statement. And let's see that. So we'll go right here.
Thank you. My name is Sanna Kangasharju. I'm from the European Parliament office. Thank you very much. Factions were mentioned very often here and their importance. I'd be really curious to hear what are your thoughts? Which are the most powerful or important factions in the new Congress, and do you see any changes in those groupings? Thank you.
Jennifer's written a book on factions.
So with the switch in majority from Republican to Democrat, and the newly elected leaders, I do think we see a pretty big shift in factions that will affect the way the House operates. Of course, the party shift, the majority party shift, is the biggest thing. Within each party, so the Republican Party, of course, the faction story there is that it's the Freedom Caucus and the more extreme conservatives in the party. So the Republicans that lost their seats in this last round were mostly moderate members. So to the extent that we can think of this spatially, we should think of the Republican Party conference as a whole moving further to the right, with the anchor of that Freedom Party caucus, which has been growing in size over the last number of cycles. So, which in part explains a lot of the, the struggles that the last few speakers of the House have had. So there's not much of a story change there, I think, on the Republican side, except that we're just seeing an amplification of what we've seen over the last couple of cycles. So that part will get worse, if you want to say it that way. On the Democratic side, we've seen a real change, I think, in both rhetoric and narrative, and the number of more wholly progressive Democrats that are coming in that will change the nature of the way the Democratic Party operates. So the last number of years, even when they were in the previous majority, I would say the Democrats were largely driven more by moderate members, and that is reflective in some of the spatial analyses that we do on members of Congress and how they behave and vote and so forth. And now, you know, you're all of a sudden we're having conversations about different proposals about Medicare for all. There wasn't a single Democrat that ran in 2008 or 10. You know, there weren't, certainly not more than a handful that were talking about Medicare for all, and now there's a whole gaggle of them. And so that to me is a real signal as to how the caucus itself is changing, with maybe a little bit more of an emphasis on that progressive anchor, if you will. I don't know if that's the right word that I want to use. But I do think that we have broader spread in the Democratic caucus that's coming in compared to either the existing Republican one or even the previous Republican one.
And one interesting race that's up today for the first one up on in the Democratic caucus is for caucus chairman, and they've got two members of the Black caucus that are running against each other. So that I think shows you how that caucus has been expanding both in chairmanships as well as into the leadership.
I think we've seen already an important difference in how I think Pelosi, if she is elected Speaker, may try and manage the different factions within her caucus from, say, how John Boehner did with the emergence of the Freedom Caucus. So Pelosi so far has taken a very sort of carrots-based approach to managing the different caucuses in the different factions in her caucus. So, you know, promising different members that they'll get to be particularly active on high-profile issues, infrastructure, gun violence, that sort of thing. Giving, you know, so Marcia Fudge, who had been rumored as a candidate to challenge Pelosi for Speaker, Pelosi said, "Oh, I will resurrect a subcommittee on the House Administration Committee, and I'll give you the subcommittee chairmanship." And so it's been very sort of carrots-based so far. It's unclear sort of how long that can last. But Boehner largely took a very sort of sticks-based approach to keeping some of those members in the Freedom Caucus in line. So, you know, my favorite example of this is Tim Huelskamp of Kansas, who aggravated Boehner so much that he removed him from the Agriculture Committee. And it turns out that in Kansas, if you get kicked off the Agriculture Committee, that can actually make a difference. And he was successfully primaried by another Republican, partially on those grounds. And so that's an important kind of difference in faction management that I've seen so far that I'll be paying attention to as things unfold.
I think it's hard to know, though, whether or not that difference is the management style or management philosophies of the leaders or the nature of the people in the caucuses themselves, right?
Like the retail are possible, but it struck me so far as a difference, and it'll be interesting to see whether it's a sustainable difference going forward.
Yeah.
Don't you think there are some sticks behind the scenes?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't think she lacks sticks. I mean, she may have carrots too. But okay, let's.
One of the things that Boehner did when they had other people running against him for Speaker on the floor was to remove both of them. Daniel Webster was one of them, and I can't remember the other one, but they were both members of the Rules Committee. They were immediately off the Rules Committee, and I think they were out by the next election. So.
Okay, Mr. Sorrell. Here.
Hi, thanks for a great panel. Jordan Tama from American University. Wondering whether you think outside groups may be playing into the phenomenon of party leaders using more closed rules and procedures, in the sense that outside groups that are tied to the parties often have expectations that the party will deliver on certain campaign promises. They'll be able to pass legislation that the groups want. And so does that put pressure on the party leaders to use more closed processes so they can move legislation through more quickly to satisfy these outside groups that the party is tied to?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because you see the Rules Committee is not heavily lobbied directly, but it's the committees that are bringing the bills and what they ask for from the Rules Committee and what the leadership asks for. And one of the things that you've noticed during Pelosi's bid to get reelected as Speaker has been getting all these endorsements from outside groups, labor, education, environment, and so on. There's going to be a time when they're going to say, okay, we backed you 100%. Now can you help us out and make sure that this bill that we like is not undermined by poison pill amendments? So, I mean, I think that's something you're going to see in play, even though Jim McGovern at least has indicated that he wants to have a more open amendment process. So it's going to be, yeah.
But I also think that leaders have some alternatives, and not just leaders, the caucus or the party groups themselves, I think, have alternative ways of appeasing outside groups. And so one of the things I've found in my research, so I look at congressional caucuses, and there's been this steady growth. It's like linear trend. I can probably give you an exact range of how many caucuses I think will be in the 116th. I should calculate that, actually. And part of the big story about why that's happening is the outside groups, because the groups have figured out that establishing or helping to establish and maintain various types of issue caucuses are an excellent way to get a sort of volunteer, hand-picked group of members who maybe don't have the right committee jurisdiction or whatever, and don't have to adhere to party. In the caucus, it's such this sort of casual little group that it's a privileged access point for the outside groups. And so it could be that if outside groups get frustrated with leadership, or because I could completely see the party leader saying to the outside groups, yeah, sure, we'd like to help you, but the Senate, but the White House, like, sorry, hands tied. But what we can do is grow this caucus and give you this access to all of these key members who have voluntarily said they care about your issue. And I think we've seen that happening over the last number of Congresses, regardless of which party is in power. It's a total bipartisan trend, and I expect we'll see that more.
Okay, right here.
Yes, I'm Susan
Oh,
Carroll.
can you wait just 1 second for the mic? Yep, perfect.
The International Heart Hub, and the subject of polarization, of course, is on everyone's mind. Jennifer, you said that conditions of polarizations are structural and embedded. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to think about it is, there's a lot of hemming and hawing, particularly in the punditry these days, to look at recent causes of polarization. It was Barack Obama's fault. It was Trump's fault. It's social media's fault. It's Fox News's fault. It's Clinton's fault. It's the other Clinton's fault. Won't ask you which order you just imagined those in. And largely, the evidence doesn't support any of that. Largely, if we just look at the trend as to when members of Congress began this sort of really polarization trend in their voting record, it goes back to the 1970s. And so if we want to point to key structural differences that began that trend, I'll point you towards the issue that we were talking about at the top of the panel, which was the restructuring of the electorate towards racial conservatives moving from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And that restructuring of the parties, which was a gradual change that happens over the course of a couple of decades, and is largely a response to Democrats enacting the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So it's an explicit strategy on the part of Richard Nixon and the Republican Party. At least it starts there. And what that brings us to, by the time you get to the turn of the century, is this near perfect correlation between ideology and party, where liberals are wholly in the Democratic Party and conservatives are wholly in the Republican Party. And frankly, I know my students all think that's normal, but it's weird. It's weird in American politics to have that perfect correlation between ideology and party, and it's happened because of this electorate shift. So that's one big structural thing. The second thing is, frankly, and this has come up a couple of times, campaign finance. So what we have in the 1960s and 1970s is major change in campaign finance reform in ways that ultimately, at first they empower parties, and then after McCain-Feingold and then Citizens United, we've disempowered parties. And all of the incentives that exist to increasingly raise more money for candidates, but doing so outside of the party structure creates conditions that incentivizes more extremists to, ideological extremists to seek office and to do so successfully.
Okay, we can go right here. I think right behind you is the mic.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I'm Carl Pulzer, and I've got a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity. It's about exploring inequality and also promoting inclusion of the bottom half. And my question is, for this bottom half, the working class, the Democrats aren't really known for the promoting economic issues that appeal to the working class. It's more the elites and protecting welfare programs, where I see the Republicans more as a fusion of Trump's appeal to the working class and the traditional Republican constituencies. My question is, as the Democrats prepare the issues they're going to work on in the House, will there be any shift a bit away from identity politics and more toward the economic issues of the working class? You know, minimum wage, sick days, not family leave, but sick days, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there will be. We see that in statements they've already put out as to what their priorities are going to be, and that includes, lowering drug prices, increasing the minimum wage. So I think that they are shifting gears somewhat and making sure that they try and recapture some of the folks that they lost in 2016. But we'll see.
I mean, one thing that we have, we talked a little bit about the new House freshmen, and one of the things that we've seen some conversation around in these early weeks after the election is the presence in the new House Democratic Caucus of a number of members who themselves identify as working class. So Don mentioned before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who beat Joe Crowley in a primary in Queens. She has not been shy about talking about the way that her working class background has been an impediment to running for office. There are, I think, some other Democrats in the caucus who are talking about this. And so to the extent that some of the generational change we're seeing foreshadows a broader conversation about the importance of having more working class individuals in Congress and how do we get them there, I think has been encouraging to me so far.
I'm going to add the issue of trade, which I think is one that we've always had a hard time figuring. And certainly, broadly speaking, the Republican Party had been very pro-free trade, and the Democratic Party had been a little split in that their presidents were very pro-free trade, but the Congressional Caucus was actually, much more skeptical of trade than their presidents. Now that we have a president who's moved on trade in a way that is not typically Republican, it'll be interesting to see what a Congressional Caucus does with those issues. Not that I think they're going to have a great meeting of the minds, but I think there's sort of cross pressures on the caucus in a way that we'll see how they work out.
I think, John, that you're going to see a coming together of sorts over the redrafted NAFTA agreement, because there will still have to be implementing legislation for that. And so that means that Congress is going to have to approve that, and you're seeing a mix among the parties for this, not necessarily for that, but I think there is a lot of room to come together on that issue. And obviously the Democrats will still be emphasizing, how this affects labor and environment as that matter too. But I'm just seeing that as one of the fruitful areas that might actually show that there's still a possibility of bipartisanship.
I want to talk about this for just a second, because I'm glad you raised this issue for two reasons. One is it directly ties to the polarization question as not as a structural thing, but the evidence suggests that one of the major causes of political polarization is income inequality and wealth inequality. And so if we seek to do something, if we think polarization is a problem and gridlock is a problem, and we seek to do something about that, then policy proposals that try to address income inequality are particularly one of the most fruitful things I think we could probably do to address that issue. Second is, I think the question of whether or not Democrats or anybody really is going to try to make headway on some of the issues you mentioned in your question, to me this is very emblematic of the struggle in the Democratic Party at all right now. It's sort of the story of what we think might happen, because I think the Democrats are going to be in a little bit of a tangle as to, I'm particularly thinking about, I'm just going to say the Bernie bro faction, right? So you had this progressive/populist faction that got all of this attention in 2016. A lot of those folks are still there. Some of them might be bleeding into the Republican Party, and I think the Democratic Party is going to have to decide, are we going to make moves to keep those populist Bernie bros in the Democratic fold, or are we going to go more free trade and try to pick up some of the Republicans that are now disaffected because they're uncomfortable with Trump-style politics? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a clear strategic positioning. I don't think they can do both, and I think we're going to have to watch to see which way they go.
Okay, we're going to go over there in the back.
Jason Donovan, not with anyone. The one word I haven't heard mentioned at all today was demographics. Could the change of the demographics of the United States be why Congress is the way it is now, and that the demographic trends will just continue to push it in a certain direction?
John's my demographic expert.
I will say, so we actually are part of a kind of coalition of think tanks that does work on this States of Change project with left and right think tanks around town and try to sort of put out the best data on this. So I recommend that to you. Look, I mean, I think broadly speaking, we've known for a while that some of the bigger demographic trends, the growth of Hispanics in the electorate, the young vote being very Democratic, are more favorable to the Democratic Party. Obviously, our last election shows that there are many ways to get to I wouldn't call it exactly a majority, but a win in the election. And some of the trends that are favoring Republicans are this great growth in their support of the white working class, which is a shrinking group, but it's still a big group. So. I do agree with Jennifer that there are underlying economic and inequality and other issues that do affect how the caucuses look and how the polarization goes. But I will just say I do think the demographic big line stories probably are true and favor Democrats, but slightly more complicated. And the time frame on these things makes it so much that I don't think we should think of this as a inevitable march towards the Democratic dominance over time.
I think that's right. I guess I would just add a couple of thoughts. One of my favorite books around the time of the 2016 election by a political scientist up at the University of Wisconsin, Kathy Kramer, was about the politics of resentment and this idea of being resentful and figuring out who is deserving of what from government and having ideas about who already gets what from government and whether or not those ideas are right or wrong apparently doesn't matter. But all of whatever background you come from, whatever identities categories you put yourself in, that idea of are you resentful and who are you resentful towards and why really shapes our politics in a profound way. And Kathy's book just does a wonderful job of getting at some of that, particularly in Wisconsin. The other thing is you can't think about demographics without thinking about space. Right? So it's not just demographic change that is affecting the parties, and what you have is, frankly, throughout our history, whenever the dominant class, and this isn't just American history, like human history, when the dominant class is threatened or feels threatened, you get strife and you get anxiety and you get fear and sometimes you get violence. And so some of what we're seeing happen now, particularly in the Republican Party, is evidence of that. So that's not going to go away anytime soon. That dominant class and here we're mostly talking about the white majority is sort of under threat by the changing demographics. You add into that the politics of space and urbanization versus suburbanization versus rurals, and how and I want to use the word sorting because I don't think it's so much sorting as sort of an internal infection, the way that we social network with one another and get each other to think alike. All have really profound effects on the way that our politics organizes. So is that what's wrong with Congress? I don't know. But it certainly is part of what explains how we got to where we are right now. And it's not necessarily something that we're trying to do anything about, as far as I can tell. Or, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there.
One thing I might quickly add that sort of came out of our work that John mentioned, it's a project called States of Change, and one of the things Sean Trendy, great political and election analyst, wrote in a paper for us about that, is that there's a lot of naivety in assuming that the things that we think are true now about certain demographic groups will remain true, and that makes it difficult to project out how they will act in the future. And I think one of the things we see a lot of uncertainty around, although maybe one of the parties thinks they've got it really figured out, is obviously around Hispanics and how they vote. And certainly I think Bill Nelson got a little bit of a surprise in his performance among Hispanics in his Senate election. And there were some questions raised about whether Beto O'Rourke performed as well as people expected him to. And so some of that brings up different all Hispanic Americans are not alike, and certainly where they are from plays into some of that. But if you, and I really encourage you to go read this paper that we have from Sean Trendy on this. And, if you had looked at the demographics or what people thought different demographics groups would do based on the parties they thought their allegiances were to in 1920 versus now, you wouldn't have a really good, it would not have served you well going forward.
Well, we are coming to the end of really a great panel. I want to thank all of the participants here, and again mention and congratulate Don on his new book, Changing Cultures in Congress. Thank you for all coming.
And I'll be available to sign the books you purchased. So.
All right.